Hi, you are with Caroline Robinson from the Wheatbelt Business Network and the lovely Katrina McLeod from Cullen MacLeod Lawyers. And today, Kat is going to give us an update on the new commercial leasing legislation that's come out as a result of the current situation with COVID-19. Kat, just to start us off, do you want to just give us a rundown of who Cullen MacLeod is and what you do?
Sure, thanks Caroline. Cullen MacLeod is a firm that's based in Perth, and we have 18 lawyers who work across a broad variety of areas, which we generally say are 5 specialist areas, 5 specialist teams, which can broadly be broken up into property and commercial, so basically leasing, tenancy disputes, shareholder issues. So for example, anything that requires a document to be created, usually for a business. So that's the property and commercial team. Then we have the dispute resolution team, who do disputes across generally all areas that touch a person or a business. So again, something like if one of your members was selling a business and it got a bit tricky and there ended up being an argument, that's one of the things we deal with. Or employment disputes, again, tenancy disputes. So our property and commercial team deal with the front end, hopefully tie it up so it's watertight, so hopefully you avoid the disputes. Then if they do rear their ugly head, then it comes to my team, which is dispute resolution. That's the second team. Then the third team is family law, so that's pretty self-explanatory. That's the team you hope you really never have to see. But if you do, then we have a team that specialises in family law, including asset protection. So oftentimes people think of family law as just being when things go wrong, but a really vital part of the family law team is protecting the assets with things like binding financial agreements, especially when there are, for example, multi-level generations in a family. So if a new partner comes into the family, then the family may want to protect their assets by a binding financial agreement. So that's a really common method of family law protecting and setting things up at the beginning. Then we have a wills and succession planning team, which is, well, the wills is pretty self-explanatory. Everything from mum and dad wills through to really complicated multiple level properties, trusts, which is more often the case in, for example, with some of your members' farming families who have some really complicated trusts, company structures that usually a accountant set up maybe a generation ago and they really don't have a great deal of understanding about. That's the kind of succession planning, so making sure that the right assets go to the right people. And then the fifth one is liquor licensing and hospitality team. So that's a pretty specialist one, which is anything that touches a liquor license. So anything from your local not-for-profit community sporting associations who might have a liquor license on a Friday afternoon, or right through to a hotel. Every town in the Wheatbelt usually has at least one hotel, and that's the liquor licensing. We've done a fair bit of those. So generally most things in relation to people and businesses.
Perfect. And the WBN's been partnering with Cullen MacLeod and vice versa. You guys have been partnering with us for a long time. And yeah, we appreciate your time in sharing some information with our members today.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
So today, today we're going to just talk about this commercial leasing laws. And I just wanted to ask you what they are and what or who do they apply to?
Yeah, so it's an incredibly complex area. As you and your members will have seen, it has been changing almost weekly for the last 4 or 5 weeks. So there's a broad base of legislation, which is, to be honest, so tricky that it's taken even the property lawyers some real unraveling to work out how it works and who it applies to. And that makes sense because it has been trying to do things quickly on the run, but basically protect businesses. So they have definitely started from the standpoint of how do you protect the economy, protect the tenant, and be fair to the landlords as well. So there's probably 3 major pieces of policy and legislation that have come out, and I won't bamboozle you with all the names and details. What I'd said to you actually, Caroline, was that for your members, I can give a broad overview of the things that I find as a business owner and also a tenant and also a landlord really important to me. And then we had discussed we can get one of our property lawyers to come and give you a lot more specific details, and maybe even take some Q&As in advance from your members who would like to know some really specific information. But I'd say the basic for commercial tenancies is the government has passed basically something called a code, and it's basically a guideline that is there to guide landlords and tenants. And that has a whole raft of different provisions, but separate to that, they've enacted legislation. And the difference is the legislation is binding, the code isn't. So piece by piece, the legislation is expected to be updated and amended to keep taking into account more of the code and making it mandatory. So for now, I guess the main takeaway for your members is that it's purely the legislation itself that binds them. And that legislation has a number of key requirements, which go to me directly to the heart of a tenancy or a lease. So things like not paying rent, being terminated, walking away, all of those are covered by the new legislation, which came into effect just at the end of March, and it goes through critically to the 29th of September. So there's basically this kind of 6-month emergency period where the government had said, okay, we have to almost freeze/hibernate leases at this point. So nothing major can really happen unless it's a really unusual circumstance. So some of the main ones that they've done that to is, for example, number 1, you can't really evict a tenant right now for non-payment of rent. And you can't really evict a tenant. So actually, sorry, to go back to your original question, who does it apply to first? So there are 4 subcategories of people and businesses who it applies to. But basically, if you're a commercial tenant and you're a small business, then it's going to apply to you. There are definitely subcategories, but if you're a small business who's running your business from that property, then that lease is likely to apply to you. And you can definitely speak to some of our property lawyers to find out if you're one of the exceptions that doesn't, but that's really, really rare. So normally, as a small business, it's going to apply to you. And that's in line with the policy from the government trying to protect small businesses, and who we know are pretty much the key to our entire Australian economy keeping going. So it was it's a understandable, I guess, protective 6 months. I guess number 1, can't increase the rent. So that's a definite no-no in the 6-month period. You can't terminate a tenant in that period. You can't increase the rent. There are certain other steps that they can and can't take. And then critically, they've also removed all the ability to just run off and go to court. So basically, there's a dispute resolution process that now has to be followed. And once that's followed, then after that, then there is a potential to go to different areas to then be able to, I guess, go to court and resolve the dispute. Just going to check my cheat notes here that I got from our property lawyer because I remember her. So she basically gave me some cheat notes so we could have this discussion. So with the dispute, which was really interesting to me. So before you could just run off to court, you could run off and terminate the rent, go to court, get a declaration that it was terminated validly or not, or the tenant could go to court and say, no, this is wrong. Whereas now, if it's a small business lease, and that's a specific definition, then they have to go to the Small Business Development Corporation. So that's a massive change, which is basically the Small Business Commissioner, and they are incredibly useful to small business. So I've actually been involved with them and met the Small Business Commissioner. and they will actively, for free, which is the really critical part for me, for free help both the tenant and the landlord try and work through the dispute. And this doesn't cost anyone anything. So it's, to me, a better step for businesses that are currently in huge cash flow than, to be blunt, going to a lawyer. So we've always advised small businesses to go to the Small Business Development Corporation as step one and just see if you can get some help and get it sorted. So small business leases have to go to the Small Business Development Corporation, and then other leases have to go to the State Administrative Tribunal, which is basically just a specialist tribunal that's totally separate from the courts. So the new requirements have said, okay, for 6 months, these are the 2 places you have to go to resolve your disputes. And they're a lot more friendly. The benefit to small businesses is they're a heck of a lot more friendly towards just people going in and negotiating themselves and not being, I guess, having to deal with court processes, procedures, the right words, you know, oak paneling and that whole intimidating feeling that comes around with going to court quite often. The State Administrative Tribunal is totally set up for people to represent themselves. You can take lawyers if you want to, but you can also do it yourself. So that's a really good development, I think, to basically, sounds terrible in my job, almost remove the lawyers and let the people and the government almost help them and resolve it as step one.
What if you had to give a piece of advice to a landlord at the moment,
yeah,
and then I'll ask you what piece of advice you'd give to a tenant, what piece of advice would you give to a landlord at this point in time?
So I would say to the landlord, number one, if your tenant has come to you wanting something, so wanting, for example, a rent reduction or they're not paying the rent, I guess it would depend on what situation they're in. But say, for example, the landlord has come and said, my tenant isn't paying rent, I want to get rid of them. So I would say to them, well, you actually can't for a while. And understandably, you have probably got a backed up mortgage that you're having to pay. So there's a whole realm of other more commercial advice behind that regarding what they can do with their own mortgages, which is an entirely separate issue, but they can definitely get relief usually. But I would say to them, go back to your tenant and tell the tenant they have to prove financial hardship to get most of these relief provisions. So they can't just rock up and say, I've seen the news, nope, not paying my rent. What can you do about it? So flip it back on them. Be kind, but be firm. So people are really, really struggling, and you generally can't get blood out of a stone. And ultimately, you want to look to the long term. So if this is going to be over, it will be over. And ultimately, if you can help the tenant through this particular phase, and the government is now actually requiring you to help them through that phase, but you will both come out better at the end if they are still there and can pay the rent. And critically, this doesn't take away the requirement for them to pay the rent. They still technically, so far, they still have to pay it. The landlord can't take certain measures that they would have taken before to basically, for example, terminate. Usually under you provide a notice period, termination notice, and you get rid of them. But I imagine, especially in a lot of areas, it's not going to be easy to get businesses that can pay rent in a way. So removing one tenant for the potential, bird in the hand, 2 in the bush, commercially, it's a really difficult decision anyway. So my advice would be, go back to the tenant, ask them what they want, negotiate with them, get them to show the financial hardship, and go from there. Does that make sense?
I think yeah, it does, and I think that also applies probably to the tenant too. That the whole that there needs to be a conversation between both parties, and there needs to be sometimes a quite frank but empathetic conversation. That's right. That's right. So
and they both have bills to pay. Everybody has bills to pay. Everybody, ultimately, no one is doing this for kindness or at the good of the heart. Landlord has, you know, structural things they have to deal with, maintenance, upkeep. The tenant has to deal with their lives. So definitely an open and frank discussion with some, and I would say exactly like you're saying, to both, with actual evidence. Don't come to a landlord asking for help, which is really what you're saying, asking for help. You can't show why you really need the help, because they will be likely suffering themselves. So it's a shared risk and a shared responsibility for now.
Yeah, agree. I think that's a really good quick little snapshot about that new piece of legislation. And I know for our members, we've sent out the little guide that Cullen MacLeod have done. But for those members that might not have seen that in our e-news, you can get it on the Cullen MacLeod website, which is just cullenmacleod.com.au, and it's under the new little box there that you can go and follow it. But yeah, I think that's a really great snapshot, Kat, about that. And your team certainly has a wide variety of skills, and we've always encouraged our members to make contact with you guys, because you do provide good advice. So yeah, no, it's good. Well, thanks, Kat. And yeah,
well, I've said to you before, in this period, we're absolutely happy for your members just to call up and ask. Like I said, we have a whole bunch of lawyers who are across a lot of different areas. So other areas that we're seeing come up repeatedly are, for example, employment questions, or questions around I'm not being paid, what are my options to get paid? So there's a whole bunch of areas. And your members are absolutely welcome to just call up, ask for me to begin with, and then I'll assign them to the relevant lawyer, and they can have a free chat about pretty much whatever issue they're facing. And usually we'll have someone who's got expertise in the area.
Thanks, Kat. That rocks. Thank you ever so much. I know our members will be really appreciative. They'll love that. And and I'll reiterate, just, yeah, phone Kat. And if you haven't got Kat's number, then, yeah, speak to me and I'll give it to you.
Lovely talking to you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Kat, and we'll catch up soon.
That'd be fabulous. Take care. Bye.
Brilliant. Bye.